This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is Jenny Ifft with K-State's Agricultural Economics Department, as she discusses how agriculture has financially been impacted by the dry weather. Sarah Lancaster, Weed Management Specialist at K-State, continues the show as she reviews pre-emergence herbicides in wheat and how to treat bindweed. We are also joined by Rod Bain and Mark Jekanowski to share information about the domestic corn balance sheet. Concluding the show is Kansas State University horticulture and garden instructor Cynthia Domenghini as she discusses the benefits of composting and how to get started with mixing green and brown materials for the best compost material. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned into Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show with some information talking about how drought and heat impacts farm incomes. And then to talk about that, we have K-State Flinchbaugh Agriculture Policy Chair in the Department of Agricultural Economics, Jenny Ifft. Jenny, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here.
So why is this something we're talking about right now?
Right now I have a couple different studies that, like you said, look at the price and farm-level financial impacts of drought. And as a preview of what we find and what everybody knows, drought is bad. Drought hurts. But what these studies do is they try to dig a little bit deeper. How bad is just sort of the degrees of bad, and how are farms adapting? And there's really two reasons why we look at this. So I do a lot of work in farm policy. There's crop insurance, forage insurance, livestock insurance, plus the FSA programs, Farm Service Agency programs, that are triggered directly or indirectly by drought. So understanding how producers respond to drought, what they're doing themselves, and how these policies work is generally important at a high level, and we're working towards that. There's also practical implications. One of the studies looks at drought and hay prices. That's something producers have to plan for. The other studies look at farm income and lending in response to extreme heat or drought, and that's something that not only affects farmers, it affects lenders and ultimately rural communities.
What kind of is that impact looking like?
Well, let's start on the study of drought and hay prices. This is a study where we look at state-level hay prices and drought trends over several decades. We also looked at drought within districts of an individual state. And it really depends how you measure drought. And so basically once drought gets really bad, so if you're looking at Drought Monitor every week like a lot of us are, you have moderate, severe, extreme, and exceptional. And really the impact gets a lot bigger once you get up to those extreme or exceptional. So once things turn red, it gets a lot worse. So the impact of a exceptional drought is 4 or 5 times bigger in dollar terms on hay prices than the impact of a moderate drought. And that's true for both alfalfa and grass hay. Grass hay is, in fact, a little bit more sensitive. So the markets are pretty resilient to drought to a point, and then it gets really bad. And I think that's where a lot of places are right now. I heard of somebody shipping in hay from Manitoba, so that's a long ways away.
And Jenny, are there any other interesting characteristics of the hay market as it relates to the drought?
You could treat it as a commodity, but it's not really a commodity in the sense that corn is. There's a lot of, corn can get shipped pretty easily by rail throughout the U.S. to where it needs to be. You can also ship hay pretty far, but the transportation costs relative to the amount of energy that's being provided are a lot higher. So it is something that you can trade. It is a commodity, but transportation costs are higher. And there's also just so many different types of hay. So part of this study, was trying to understand what's the relationship between drought and hay prices and also between these different, local, regional conditions.
If Kansas was experiencing a drought, did our surrounding states also feel that impact?
Yeah, or does it matter? Does the hay price in Kansas, is it affected by drought in surrounding states? And so that's one of the things that we did. We did look at, and what we found is the impact in drought in bordering states is just as big as the impact within an individual state. The impact of drought in bordering states is the same or larger than a drought within your own state. So these regional conditions really matter. And if you think about that, it's not, if you have a drought, yes, your forage yields are going to go down. The term crap hay gets used a lot when I talk to people about drought and hay prices. So the quality goes down, your yields go down. So that happens, and that's going to affect prices because there's less hay. But there might be less cattle as well. So, from that side, it's sort of balancing out. Okay, you have less hay, but producers might be, lowering down their cattle inventories. They might be doing additional culling. And so we're really measuring a sort of a net impact. But I think the fact that you can potentially transport hay to a degree, and the fact that these cattle markets are linked across space does create some sensitivity to regional conditions.
Jenny, what hays did you look into when you were trying to kind of figure this all out?
So one thing that we modeled we looked at both alfalfa and grass hay. So the question was, have these markets become more or less responsive to drought over time? And really, if you look at the renewable fuel standard, there's other things increasing foreign demand for commodities. But if you look at that 2005 to 2007 period, commodity markets, for grains and oilseeds really changed during that period. And what we found is that alfalfa price is not becoming more responsive to drought, but grass hay price is more responsive to drought than in the past. And that what basically tells us is that these markets are more linked than they used to be.
At K-State, we have the Kansas Farm Management Association and K-State's Agricultural Economics Department, and something they look at is farm incomes. And so have you seen some impacts with that?
Yeah, definitely. So, the Kansas Farm Management Association, they work with several farms across the state, and they've been tracking farm incomes for decades. And because of this partnership we have, we can look at the impact of extreme heat on farm income. Now, we don't look at the trends of extreme heat over centuries. We're economists, but we did look at the last decade versus more recent decades. And there has been more extreme heat in the last decade. And generally, we did find a pretty big impact on farm income. So the measure we use is something called extreme degree days. Was it useful for research? But it's a little bit hard to think of it in practical terms, so we convert it to degrees. And what we look at is the impact of a 1 degree Celsius, or not quite 2 degrees Fahrenheit, increase in heat. So an increase in warming, we look at what's the impact on gross farm income and net farm income. Now, that level of warming is very comparable to the 2012 drought. So it's something we're familiar with. And what we find is that net farm income is 66% lower in response to that level of higher temperatures. So it's about 2/3 lower than normal.
But a little bit different looking at gross income.
It's smaller for gross income, and there's two reasons for that. One of it's just tight margins. So a small decrease in gross income, that's a large share of your profit margin. So that's part of it. We also see expenses increasing a little bit as farms try to adapt to these changes.
And something that producers also usually think about when it comes to taking care of their operation, crop insurance.
Yeah, definitely. So we did look at, we know that producers, especially in Kansas, are used to bad weather, and they take actions to prepare. And there's also policies like crop insurance. So we did find that crop inventories adjust during periods of extreme heat to help mitigate the impact. Farms with access to irrigation are less impacted by drought. But crop insurance is really the big one. The impact of extreme heat would be about double without crop insurance. And that really, with crop insurance, there's a deductible, right? And so that 50% is about what you'd expect it to be. So crop insurance is covering some of those losses, but not all of them.
One more study that we're going to mention that you've worked on is how lending practices have changed over the past years.
So this study wasn't originally motivated by drought or extreme heat or weather. We were interested in if farms experiencing some type of financial stress go on and add on new loans. So, are they taking on more financial risk to manage risk on the farm? Is this a response? Is there this broader trend in sort of increasing the numbers of lenders in agriculture? Farms are spreading out their credit across more lenders. So we want to understand, is this increasing financial risk? And so, when we got started on this, what's the best way to measure financial stress in agriculture? It's, drought or weather shocks that decreases yield. There's also price risk, but here we look at whether this extreme heat changes lending behavior. And the results were pretty interesting. So again, our concern was, does financial stress cause farms to take on more financial risk? And what we found was the opposite of that, which is pretty interesting. Although I've talked to folks, I've talked to lenders and others, and not necessarily surprising. So what we find is that farms don't add new lenders or loans when they experience bad weather, which leads to lower income. They do the opposite. So when there's good weather, when the weather's relatively good, that's when they're adding new loans or adding new lenders. So really that's being driven by the desire to increase investment. It is not a way to manage these weather or income risks at the farm level.
Weather impacts agriculture quite a bit there. And so in an ideal world, what would producers do probably?
Well, again, we're in a perfect world situation, but if you had a perfect world, perfect financial markets, producers would not necessarily, they wouldn't have their investment happen only during good income years. The financial system would allow them to make them investments when it's best for their operation. That's not what we see in reality. Reality is typically a little bit messy. We're still trying to dig into the why of this. But one of the things that I would say is definitely positive is that agricultural lending right now is quite resilient. The lending system is quite resilient to weather-related risks.
We talked about a lot of different things about how heat impacts agriculture and hay prices and investments. And so overall, kind of how would you sum up this work?
To go back to the big picture, drought is bad, but I think there are a lot of actions that producers take, that lenders take, others take to manage it. So right now, yes, there is a negative impact, but there is this response. It's a combination of, what farms do on their own, what lenders do, policies like crop insurance, that create some resilience to this.
That was Flinchbaugh Agriculture Policy Chair in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Kansas State University, Jenny Ifft. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show discussing some things around weeds. And then to talk about it, we have K-State Weed Management Specialist Sarah Lancaster. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on, Shelby.
On the topic of weeds, first kind of looking towards wheat and pre-emergence herbicides. So why is that important?
So pre-emergence herbicides are really just as important in wheat as they are in a lot of our other crops. I know a lot of times we think about wheat as being a very competitive crop, but anything we can do to help that wheat crop get off to a good start is going to help us throughout the growing season. So high yielding wheat needs to have good residual weed control, just like all of our other crops.
Picking through a big list of herbicides, and so how do you kind of pick out what they want?
So we need to think a little bit about what are the target weeds, right? So generally speaking, for fall herbicide applications or these pre-emergence applications, we're going to be trying to make sure we don't have horseweed, right? That's a big one that can cause lots of problems and be really challenging to control as we get into the spring. Other things to think about would be herbicides that can control some of our mustard species and then some of our brome species. So, folks are familiar with the weed pressure in each of their fields, and so choosing the herbicide that fits that field is going to be important.
And when choosing herbicides, can herbicides without residual activity be combined with herbicides with or without residual activity?
Yeah, Shelby. So we want to make sure that we're combining herbicides that have multiple effective modes of action. And so we can go in and have burn down herbicides. Again, would like to have multiple effective modes of action there, in addition to our residual herbicides. And again, multiple effective modes of action would be the best. And even some of the premix combinations, Shelby, have a residual herbicide paired with a contact herbicide. So definitely something that can and in some cases should be considered.
So hoping for producers to hopefully get the most bang for their buck there.
That's right. A lot of the expense in the application is in the time and the fuel to get across the field. So making sure we do a good job and have a comprehensive herbicide program with each pass is important.
And Sarah, something else that producers might need to think about when choosing a herbicide and using that herbicide is once you use it, that might take away the opportunity for them to use it in the future.
That's right, Shelby. So some herbicides can be used either spring or fall or both. And so it's really important for folks, if they're going to make that decision, to have a split shot type of application to make sure they don't overload that fall herbicide application. So they leave kind of room in that rate limit for the spring application as well.
And I think this is a great time to mention that the label is the law, which is one of your favorite sayings, I think.
That's one of the bumper stickers I'm going to make someday, Shelby. The label is the law. So it's important. We have the chemical weed control guide and we have the e-updates that have these kind of summaries of the labels, but it's always important that folks go back and find the details or work with someone who can help them find the details and the labels. I know I have a question in my inbox that I was answering just this morning that, one of the comments was, the labels are completely overwhelming for me as a farmer, so help me figure out what it says. And so that is totally fair. They're not straightforward to read at all.
And on those labels, something that's probably included is rotational intervals. And there's a few herbicides that you wanted to mention that have substantially longer ones than others.
Yeah, that's right. So we have historically used a lot of ALS inhibiting herbicides in our wheat rotations simply because we need them for the selectivity of trying to control grasses in grass a lot of times. But some of them, like Amber or Finesse or even Outrider, they can have rotation restrictions that really limit your ability to go back to corn or sorghum, in some cases for as much as 36 months. So it's important to make sure that you have your rotational plan in mind when you're selecting some of these herbicides. Other products like Anthem Flex or Zidua, they have nice residual activity from a group 15 herbicide, but they don't have the rotation restrictions like some of those ALS inhibiting herbicides do.
And there is a full list of this on the agronomy update of a lot of the different herbicides that producers could use.
Yeah, that's right. We ran down the list of the herbicides from the weed control guide and talked about application timing and a few of the most important comments in terms of, plant back intervals and other aspects of using the herbicides.
And another article you put out on the recent agronomy e-update is talking about field bindweed. And so what is field bindweed first?
So fun fact, field bindweed is pretty much the weed that started weed science in the Great Plains. If you look back through a lot of the historical articles from the mid to early 1900s when we first started figuring out synthetic weed control, field bindweed was the one that they were going after. It's a perennial weed, so that means it comes back year after year from very, very deep, very, very extensive rootstocks. So it is just incredibly drought tolerant because of those tremendous root reserves, and that's part of why we've been seeing it thrive relative to some of the other plants in recent years.
And K-State has done some work or has done some research on looking into field bindweed.
Yes, so some of the more recent work is actually not recent anymore, Shelby, but they've got 12 years of data from Hayes looking at field bindweed control. And so I think it's important to think about what is your long-term plan for field bindweed control, because it's not a one-and-done sort of situation. Like we said, it's a perennial weed, and it's going to regrow from those roots pretty much no matter which of the labeled herbicides we put on it. So it's important to monitor and make sure that you're making repeated applications.
What makes it stop?
Yeah, so hard freeze, right? That's what's going to make hard freeze is what's going to make it stop growing at the end of the summer. And by hard freeze, the research suggests that it's 20 degrees. So not just a frost. In fact, some of the better recommendations for control are to use a quinclorac-containing herbicide like Facet right before a light frost. That's going to switch some of the signals in the plant and allow that herbicide to move through the plant in such a way that it's going to be more effective for a kill.
You mentioned one herbicide, but what are some of the other recommended herbicides for hopefully helping control it?
Yeah, nothing super creative or unique here. We're really depending on 2,4-D, dicamba, and glyphosate for the best control. There's been a little bit of work looking at some of the other group 4 herbicides, but they're just not quite as effective as the 2,4-D or dicamba. Some evidence suggests that combinations of those products will be a little bit better than just one at a time.
And you mentioned it beforehand, it's a perennial, it doesn't just stop growing. And so does it take more than 1 year to get this calmed down?
Absolutely. I mean, I would submit to you that for some folks, it's a lifetime, right? not only does it have those very deep roots, but the seeds can survive for decades in the soil. So you have to have a plan for controlling emerging seedlings as well as those established plants. Being a perennial with the deep roots, it's one of those weeds also that we have to think about the effects of tillage systems, right? So you might think, well, I will work the ground and try to uproot it and kill it that way. Most of the evidence says you're just spreading it around when you do that. So just being aware of how your management system is impacting your herbicide needs for this weed are important.
And it's important to put together a plan for field bindweed because it can impact yield.
We think about it as impacting largely wheat yields, and it, in some cases, can reduce wheat yields by up to 50%, according to that research from Hayes that we mentioned earlier.
And you've shared a lot of information, as you always do, about different herbicides and how they can impact things. Is there a place that producers could go to look at and find even more information?
Sure, Shelby. I mentioned the weed control guide when we were talking about those wheat herbicides, and that's really historically been a great resource for folks in the state of Kansas. We're getting ready to update it for 2024, so folks can be on the lookout in January for next year's version of the chemical weed control guide.
Sarah, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and sharing with us some of your knowledge.
My pleasure, Shelby. See you next time.
That was Kansas State University weed management specialist Sarah Lancaster. She recently released 2 articles about both of these topics in K-State's Agronomy e-updates, which I will link in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net. Before we cut to our break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain and World Agricultural Outlook Board Chair Mark Jekanowski as they discuss tighter supply numbers reflected in lower production and yield forecasts from the previous month.
How did USDA's August corn crop production update impact the domestic supply and demand ledger? World Agricultural Outlook Board Chair Mark Jekanowski notes lower yield and production forecast coupled with a rise in beginning stocks from the previous month
means total supplies tightening up by 154 million bushels.
That is reflected in several use categories within the corn balance sheet.
Feed and residual is a bit lower. Feed, seed, and industrial, we reduced by 20 million bushels.
Exports were lowered 50 million bushels. Also lowered ending stocks by 59 million bushels and stocks to use ratio by 0.3% from the previous month.
With lower supplies, slightly tighter stocks, we think that that's going to support our price forecast. So we raised our season average price forecast 10 cents a bushel, currently at $4.90 per bushel.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
That was U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rod Bain, and he was joined by World Agricultural Outlook Board Chair Mark Jekanowski, and they discussed tighter supplies which are found in USDA's August domestic corn balance sheet. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead for you.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. Composting is a process that occurs naturally as organic materials break down in the landscape. Cynthia Domenghini, a horticulture and garden management instructor in Kansas State University's Department of Horticulture and Natural Resources, says that compost turns waste into treasure at little or no cost.
So really it's to the gardener's benefit to incorporate a compost heap of some type. It's happening naturally, so by following a few simple practices, you can expedite the process and really make sure that you're getting the most out of your compost experience.
A couple of things we need. We first off have to have some type of a bin, but then we also need the right mixture of materials, right?
Absolutely, yes. And the bin's not essential. If that's the one thing holding you back, you can still compost. You can compost in a heap, just a mound, really, but the bin, first of all, keeps everything a little bit tidier. It keeps your compost contained. And there are resources you can use that are low to no cost, such as using a pallet or a few pallets, creating a box system. There are compost bins that you can purchase that are cute, and they can be costly as well, but they can also facilitate turning the heap regularly. But then the materials that can go into the compost heap, You want a good mix of what's called greens versus browns. So the greens are going to be the things that are more moist, things like your grass clippings, coffee grounds, fruit and vegetable scraps, your plant trimmings. You can incorporate eggshells, certain types of animal manure. Those are all the greens, and they have the nitrogen source for your compost pile. The browns are another important piece, though. The browns are going to be your more dried materials, and that has the carbon components that you need for the microorganisms to be feeding within the compost pile. So the browns include things like fall leaves, pine needles. You could use twigs, some straw, sawdust. But the key to that, especially with the twigs, but even the fall leaves, is if you can get those mulched up into smaller particle sizes, they're going to compost much more quickly.
Is this a good time to be starting a compost pile?
Well, absolutely, because the trees are going to be starting to drop their leaves before long. It might not feel like fall, but it is coming. So, yeah, getting that compost pile built or prepared, at least having a site. If you don't have time to build the bins right now, you can at least identify a site where you could put a heap. And then maybe when the garden projects slow down this winter, you could put together the bin around the heap that you've already started. And the key to the size of your compost is you don't want to make it too big. So really, ideally, you would have a 3 by 3 by 3 foot heap. It could get up to 5 feet. That would work as well, especially if you're going to be turning it manually. Once the heap gets to be much larger than that, it's not going to be very easy to turn, and you're not going to get as good an airflow. Your materials are not going to decompose as uniformly. So as you're developing your compost system, you want to keep in mind the overall size that you're going for.
And it's really the heating and the cooling process that really makes this work?
Exactly. The microorganisms, the bacteria, the fungi, everything that's actually doing the work of decomposing these materials, they're reliant on temperature. So at lower temperatures, you're going to have some of your microorganisms working. As it heats up over 100 degrees, different organisms kick in and they start to feed. That's what is key to that compost actually becoming compost, the plant materials becoming compost, is that heat. And then as it's actually decomposed, the temperature will start to cool back down and it'll be ready to be used in the landscape. When it turns from the original materials into what some people call black gold, then you know that as the temperature is cooled, you know that it's ready to be used in the landscape.
That's Cynthia Domenghini, a horticulture and garden management instructor in K-State's Department of Horticulture and Natural Resources. More information on composting can be found in the August 8th and 15th horticulture newsletters. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.